Hi, everybody. This is Rhonda Cobb, the Money Coach, and welcome to our show. This is another one of our series for the Miami Book Fair. I'd like to invite you to see the website, www.miamibookfair.com, and stick with us. You are going to love this book. We are going to be talking to the authors, Kruse and Julian Zelizer, about the book that they wrote called Fault Lines. And before you think that sounds boring, it's not. I read it. It's great. It's a history of the United States since 1974. And I read it and I went, well, that explains a lot. So they're going to talk to us and tell us a little bit about this book. But let me tell you, these are some accomplished gentlemen. They're joining us from New York City. So if you hear a little bit of city background on the show, don't worry about it. They're in New York, and that's just the way it is. So welcome, Kevin and Julian. How are you guys today?
We're doing great. How are you?
I'm fabulous.
We're doing great and happy to be with you.
Awesome. Good. You know, it says on the inside flyleaf of the book that fault lines grew out of your own research, but it's so well researched now. How long did it take to research all this stuff?
Well, it was several years. This started as a course that we taught at Princeton, so it really started with lectures, and the two of us worked out how do you tell the story of this period, and how do you tell the story of our own life. This is the time we grew up. And so first we figured it out with lectures for several years, about 2 or 3 years, and then we started turning it into a book, and Kevin might remember exactly how many more years that took as we went through each chapter and tried to fill out the detail and figure out what are the most important stories to tell. So 5 or 6 years, I'd say, total.
Yeah, easily.
That's a pretty good commitment of time to, create a book. But fortunately, you were working from a course that you created or co-created, and that was at Princeton, right?
That's correct.
Exactly.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the book. It's so good. I really enjoyed it. But tell our listeners about the book and kind of hit on why they should get the book and read it.
All right. Well, the book really, as Julian said, it's an overview of all of American history really since the early 1970s. That's a lot to get in. And so we've organized it in kind of two big themes. One, we trace these 4 fault lines that run throughout American history, and they're fault lines of political polarization, economic inequality, fights over gender and sexuality, and divisions over race and ethnicity. And so we track the way in which Americans really have fought over those lines of division over the past 45 years. At the same time, though, we talk about the lines about who was at fault here. And so the role of the media in all of this really does factor in as a big major argument that we build throughout the book about what happens as we move from a landscape in which you really do have a kind of a narrow mainstream media to an increasingly fractured and fractious media landscape with things like talk radio and the internet and now social media and Twitter. And so as things get more complicated there, these fault lines become ever more aggravated.
Oh, absolutely. And I call them divisive forces. I just finished recording this show about the shrinking of the American dream. And one of the things that is shrinking the American dream, in my opinion, is these divisive forces.
Yeah, and then part of what we want to do when we put this book out, and we're looking forward to coming to Miami to speak about this at the Miami Book Fair, is how did we get to where we are today? Many Americans watch the politics out of Washington, and they watch many elements of American society, the fundamental divisions a lot of Americans have on key issues of the day. And some think, well, this is a product of the last few years, or this is just a product of the president or another politician. But we go all the way back to Richard Nixon and Watergate and the resignation of the president and try to slowly take you through the history that led us to this place. And that's part of the point of the book, that when readers walk away from this, they have a really good grounding on seeing everything that's happening with an understanding of the origins and coming away with a much richer feel for the foundations of what's going on today. And it's not just the divisions in society. We try to trace how our technology changed, how computers came to be and have the role that they do, even how the media evolved into its current form. And for Kevin and I, that's really, that's been the aim of the course, that's the aim of the book, and that's the aim of all the discussions we've had since it came out.
Well, it's really cool and it's really fascinating. And like you said, it tells the story of what's happened and how we got to where we are, because it seem like there's so many people that are discussing where we are, but they don't have this foundation. They don't have this knowledge because they didn't live through it like we did.
That's right. Yeah, and what we really have found to be exciting about the reception of the book is that people have reacted to it exactly like that. It helps explain this moment we're in. Now, again, we were writing this thing long before our current political moment, well before President Trump even decided to run for office. We had a full draft of this done. But the story that we tell in the book, one of increasing polarization in our politics, of concern over economic inequality, racial divisions, of the role that the media plays in aggravating all these things. These were things that we were really building beforehand. And for us, it was a real revelation because, as Julian said, this is really the story of our own lives. We were both born around the time when the book starts. And so it was really a treat for us to revisit things that we thought we knew, things like, so we looked at, say in the 80s, we looked at MTV, and I, remember that as a, source of music videos, but we discovered that MTV actually really reshaped the way in which the media worked. MTV pioneered this thing called narrowcasting. Rather than broadcasting and reaching out to a wide variety of people, they were going to slice and dice the audience and appeal to just a narrow segment of that. Well, that set up a model that a lot of different cable channels followed, and it happened in the news too. So it really, there's the lack of a common public sphere of discussing things that we used to have, and instead people are off in their own little worlds.
I think that's true. And, because then that tells me, you guys were born about the time you started this history. I might be just a couple minutes older than you, but I remember, what went on, because by the time, you're starting your history, I'm starting to come of age. And, I remember so clearly some of the things that you guys are talking about in this book. And it was so fascinating because it just showed me, oh, well, that explains that. Or, oh, I didn't really know the background of that. And then there were a couple, of course, that I did know the background of that, for example, in the Civil Rights Act that gender was thrown in as a joke. And I knew that. But so many people don't realize that it is that recent that, job equality was made a law. And so pay disparity has still not caught up to the actual law. It's a very important book. So tell people a little bit more about it, what you want them to know so that they will be encouraged to get it and read it for themselves.
Well, I'd say, part of it, it's just modern history. So it's all the stuff that in high school, they usually stop at this part of the course. 60s are over. They give you a day or two on everything that's happened since. And this is meant to be a compelling narrative of at least some of the highlights of this period. And we're hoping that readers really want to dig in to this period. It's also very relevant now. A lot of the questions that we talk about all the time are in the history of this book. So we talk a lot about the state of the economy and why are there no longer the kinds of jobs that many Americans had in the 50s that provided security and certain kinds of wages and pensions. And we'll tell you how that happened starting back in the 1970s when the economy goes through a sea change. We talk now in the news all the time about presidential power and when does Congress do something about it, and what is impeachment. And that's the beginning of our book as well. And we grapple with those issues. So I think it's both engaging for readers who just want to know either about their own lifetimes or about the lifetime of their parents and grandparents, but it's also very relevant to understanding and having a good opinion grounded on fact and history about what's taking place today, from politics to the economy and much more.
Do you think that when people, get a little bit more factual data in their hands, that will help them be more understanding and more able to formulate solutions to the current issues?
Well, that's our goal, to have this kind of sense of where the country had been, what it had gone through before. I think that's really one of the useful tools of history. And again, as Julian said, this is a part of history that just doesn't get taught a lot. The big U.S. history surveys, you kind of yada, yada, yada past the last the period since the 60s. But that's a big chunk of time. We're almost talking about a half a century here in which a lot of really important things happen and really the things that shaped our current world. So to have this information, I think it really is useful for people to make sense of where we are and where we're going by knowing where we've been.
And there's also key moments. I mean, we live in a period, obviously, where many people are frustrated and can't imagine a different place. And when I look over the book, after we've written it and as we're discussing it, it is amazing, even in this period, how many big changes we've lived through. So, two. One is between 1987 and 1991. Kevin and I write about the Cold War coming to an end, this war that everyone thought was permanent, that could lead to a nuclear catastrophe, that was unending, comes to an end. And kind of looking back at the history, I think, is an important reminder that we can, as a nation, move through these major points of contention and challenge and end up in a different place. And the same is true with the history of computing. I mean, it's unbelievable to look back at the history and start in the 70s when personal computers were not something most people were familiar with. No one would know what email and the internet would look like. But by the end of the story, everything is taking place on that platform. People are plugged in. People are communicating within seconds all over the world. Our economy, our politics, it's all taking place through this. And so those kinds of changes, I think, are really important for people to look at as we try to figure out how can we, have those kinds of changes today to get us out of some of our current crises.
Absolutely. Because, I, for one, remember going off to college and being introduced to the computer in the late 70s and looking at it and going, what? And then they wanted us to learn how to program it. The computer was as big as a room. I'm like, why do I need to program that? And
right.
Everything was in these little dashes and zeros. It made absolutely no sense to my brain at all. And I couldn't believe that this was part of our future. And look at us now. Everything you do is computerized.
That's right.
It is amazing. And there were guys in my class, man, they were like, oh, no, you do this, or you do this, and you do this. I was like, okay, yeah, thank you for the help, because if I didn't have them helping me, I would have been my grade would have been even worse than it was, and it was not laudable, to tell you the truth. So the computer thing is true. So many people did not have any good basis of computer education.
Right. Well, the assumption was, no one would need to use it, right? The idea that you would have a computer in your home, much less in your hand, like we have all today, was really an incredibly foreign concept. Those computers were, as you said, big as a room. They thought that there was no practical purpose for them outside of a giant office building. And so what we track in this are the rise of home computing, and some of those early ads are great. Where they're trying to convince people that one day you'll play canasta with somebody in Los Angeles and Dallas at the same time. One day you'll get recipes from someone across the world. You'll be able to talk to somebody over the phone without having to place a long distance